Hi everyone. Thank you so much for inviting us here today to take part in this. I think it's really great to see that carers are one of your priority groups this year and coincides quite nicely in that we've done this piece of research around the same time. I should say that I'm here today on behalf of our National Women's Officer, Kelly Temple, who was the officer lead on this research. However, it's our National Women's Conference right now, actually. So we have about 250 delegates from all over the UK at our Women's Conference discussing things like student carers, among other issues for women in education. So I am the second best, I'm afraid, but I've worked quite closely with Kelly on this project. And I think it's also worth saying as well that at NUS, because we are a democratic organisation and we're membership-led, a lot of the projects that we work on tend to have a real meaning behind them. So for Kelly, this was a really important issue for her. So it's been really wonderful to be able to work with her and kind of implement this and be able to come and present it to colleagues like yourselves. So thanks very much. So I'm going to talk you through some of the findings of our research and some of the methodology behind it, and then some of our recommendations, and I'm happy then to take sort of questions and discussion at the end. Okay, yeah, so that's a picture of the research. So some background to why we did this. So as I said, it was initiated by our Women's Officer and run by our Women's Campaign. And the reason why we decided to do this was because we were getting lots of anecdotal data and evidence about students with caring responsibilities and their impact on their study and their ability to live well. But we didn't really have any kind of data collected of proving the point. And so in that way, I think student carers are often kind of seen as a hidden demographic within higher education because there is so much data collected about different demographics of students, but there wasn't anything on student carers. And whilst there has been an increase in recognition in the role of carers and carers' rights and things like their rights to have ambitions around education taken into account, but it doesn't really do anything unless the further education and higher education sector actively go out of their way to support carers in study and provide them with the equal opportunities to succeed as their counterparts. I mean, I've already said that this was run by the Women's Campaign, and that kind of says already that we believe this to be a very gendered issue. The majority of carers overall are women, and it's the same of student carers as well. And interestingly, some analysis of some census data we did, it looks like women carers are actually more disadvantaged than male carers, at least in terms of access to education. And this contradicts and contrasts the overall picture in higher education where students are more likely to be women than men. So there's a kind of something there already that shows that there is some barriers there to women who are carers getting into education. So something just about the methodology of how we did this research. So we did a literature review, and then we did some secondary analysis of our Pounds in Your Pocket research. So Pounds in Your Pocket was a huge piece of research that we did the year prior to the carers research, and it was focusing on student finance and their impact on well-being. And I think so we had a pool of around 15,000 students take part in that. And so what we did is we went back and we honed in on that data on student carers and were able to kind of analyse the statistics on that and compare it to those that weren't student carers and what the difference was. And we also did some qualitative research with 36 student carers. So we conducted interviews and conducted our research on that part of it from those interviews. So something about the participant demographics. So the quantitative data that we analysed only focused on students in England. 76% of them were from higher education, 75% were full-time students, 12% were NHS funded, and 74% were women. So just to clarify, those were the data of student carers. So of the massive pool of data that we had of students, those were the statistics that we got for student carers. In terms of the qualitative data, we did interviews in England and Scotland. 72% were from higher education, 58% were full-time, and 80% were women. And so one of the first kind of chapters of this research was about who student carers are. So carers make up 10% of the UK population, but there are no national statistics for student carers. But we kind of estimate, based on our data, that it's about 3 to 6% of the student population. They're more likely to be mature students, but actually the majority are young students, which was quite interesting for us to find out, and they're more likely to be women as well. Access and transition. So this was all about how student carers are able to access higher education and how they're able to kind of go through the education system in a successful way. Student carers are obviously underrepresented in further and higher education. And one of the things that we found out, particularly from interviews, was that support from the institution is absolutely vital to progress, able to actually finish your mode of study, but also to succeed in it and do the best of your ability. And something that was quite interesting that came out was deciding if, where, when and how to disclose caring responsibilities was actually a big struggle for student carers. So even wanting to talk about it, the fact that you are a student carer was something that student carers found quite difficult, both to their institution, to their colleagues and to their peers. And so something about the educational experience of student carers. Only a third of respondents felt they were able to balance their commitments. Just under half of interviewees felt that their attainment had been affected by caring, and there were varying degrees of support from the institution, but lack of coordinated, systematic support. And 36% of respondents, 30% felt able to balance commitments such as work, study and family relationships, but this compared with 53% of students who weren't student carers. So there is clearly a big gap there between students who don't have caring responsibilities and those that do. And 56% of the respondents had seriously considered leaving their course at some point whilst they were studying. And again, this compares to 39% of students who didn't have caring responsibilities. So again, we can see a big gap there. In terms of retention, I did just say that one. More than half had seriously considered leaving their course, and the most common reason was for financial difficulties. So we know that for many student carers, there are a lot of strains on their ability to fund their study as well as their wider life and continue to look after those that they care for. So something about finances itself. So our pounds in your pocket research data showed overwhelmingly on the whole picture of students that access to support from families financially is massively associated with your ability to progress to further study and to do well in your study. And so actually for student carers, I think that poses a big question when we're kind of saying that we have an education system that almost relies on your ability to get some financial support from your family. There is a big worry there about how student carers are able to succeed as well as their counterparts who don't have caring responsibilities. But 2/3 said they regularly worry about not having enough money to meet basic living costs. 60% are combining paid work, caring and studying. They're more likely to work to cover basic living costs and less likely to receive support from families. Now, we say at NUS that we think that for students it can be actually quite helpful and good for their personal development to work while studying, but we always say that it can't come at the price of your ability to study and to do the best of your ability, and that's something that we're seeing very consistently now from students across the board, that students are more and more having to take on part-time work in order to fund their studies. And so again, when we think about student carers, some student carers don't have the ability or the opportunity to take on part-time work, and so it raises a question about how they're going to be able to fund their studies, but also how they're going to balance those commitments between studying, working and caring. So, debt. Student carers are 3 times as likely to have taken on high-risk debt than their counterparts, and higher overall amounts of debt. So 19% have more than £5,000 of debt. And again, in our wider research of pounds in your pocket, we found some really interesting correlations between the level of debt that you have and your ability to do well in your study. And even small amounts of debt can have a huge impact on your well-being and your ability to study. So even debts of up to or around £1,000 showed a really, really crucial turning point in your ability to live well. So financial support. So student carers are more likely not to receive any student financial support. They're more likely to receive state benefits. The loss of carers allowance for full-time students was identified as a particular key barrier by those that took part in the interviews. And 28% said it was not at all clear how much financial support they would receive. So there is definitely something there around not just what support is available, but also how that's communicated to students, both those who are currently studying and those who are looking to study. And student life, so the kind of broader experience of being a student. Many student carers said they'd sacrificed some or all of their social life to provide care and study at the same time. And something that I think was particularly interesting was that young student carers said they were more likely to support the idea or welcome the idea of a student carers group, be that physical or virtual. So, you know, we know now that for a lot of students, the kind of experience and personal development that you get outside of your study is just as valuable as what you get inside the classroom. And we don't think that student carers should be, you know, not have access to that either. So that was particularly interesting to think about how we think about things in a non-academic sense. Personal impacts. So there was just generally a lower well-being on every indicator of the survey when we compared the data of student carers to those of those students who didn't have caring responsibilities. There was a particularly big impact on well-being, so not even just your ability to study, but just your general well-being and ability to live well while studying and caring. But some of the good parts that came out was that students said that they felt that they were able to gain some kind of identity outside of being a carer. They felt they were able to gain some independence, and there was definitely a sense of accomplishment from those who had caring responsibilities and you know, were well on their way to completing their study. So these were some of the recommendations that we came up with from the report. So the first one was about collecting data on student carers. So as I said, we have this wealth of data about those that participate in education, but a lot of institutions don't collect any data on student carers, though I think I've just been told this morning that you are starting to do that now this year. So congratulations, you can tick that one off. So we also said that including student carers in widening participation work was really important, and actually identifying ways that student carers can fit into those strategies. Improving information, advice and guidance, so making sure that the support that is available to student carers is really well signposted and made available, particularly to those who are considering going into education. That's really important, as it will have a really big impact on their decision whether they will go to study or not. Developing systems for disclosure and support. So what I was saying earlier about how student carers felt unable to actually talk about the fact that they were a student carer, some kind of system in place that creates an environment where student carers feel able to do that is really important. And advancing institutional policies and practices. So that's really about looking at the policies and practices that you have in place and thinking about whether they are applicable to student carers, or whether something different needs to be done for student carers, or whether student carers need to be specifically named in those policies and procedures is really important. And replacing the carers allowance for full-time students. And enabling participation in student life. So looking at the wider student experience, how can student carers fit into that? And, you know, I think what we were saying as well about how this kind of virtual sort of space has become really prominent now for a lot of students, particularly those at the Open University. So that's also something to consider. So this was just something that we put together to show what we thought all of the kind of stakeholders in this were. So institutions, students' unions, us as NUS, and government and policy makers. So we kind of believe that actually if we are going to really further the work that's done on student carers, it's not good enough for just one of these four to be working on it. It needs to be all four working together in order to achieve success. So that's all of my slides, but I'm happy to take some questions or comments or discussions around how you think this might fit into your work that you've been doing, or how you might perhaps, oh, there's a question straight away.
Yeah, can I just ask about some of the sort of, I don't know, assumptions possibly behind...
Okay.
The first is, you're clearly focused on full-time students, and I'm guessing that you're probably talking about relatively young carers.
Not necessarily. I mean, I think in terms of how we formulated kind of conclusions and recommendations, it was based on the data that we had access to, and so we did have more of a pool of full-time students, and there certainly were a big number of young student carers in it. But I think actually, generally, the stuff we came out with is applicable to student carers as a whole.
Because in a sense, you're talking to people who have been able to become students,
yeah,
despite being carers. Whereas I'm sort of wondering if you're looking across the life course, there's going to be a large number of people who might be interested in becoming students who can't because they are carers.
Yeah.
So in a sense, it's almost like a tip of the iceberg potentially. These are the people who've been successful at getting to some sort of higher or further education, whereas there's presumably a much bigger part of the iceberg where those caring responsibilities just sort of stop them doing it, and that's probably going to get worse, for people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and so on.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think, I mean, you're right, and the fact that all of our research was conducted with students, there is something that says that they've already kind of overcome a barrier, first of all. But I do think there is something there around learning from the experiences of those students and the struggles that they face to get there. And I also think that there's a real balance to be struck between when we're talking about anything to do with students, about how we balance access and retention. And for me, I don't see the two things as being mutually exclusive. So if we're going to look at how we can get more students accessing education, then we need to look at the struggles that current students are facing in order to retain them and to create an environment where people can come through. Any other questions or thoughts?
Thank you for that. That was really interesting data there, and we also with our rather fancy widening access strategy. It's actually called the Widening Access and Success Strategy.
Right, great.
And I just wonder if you'd say a little bit more, if you found out anything more about the extent to which students were in a sense struggling with their academic progress as a result of caring responsibilities.
I think probably the biggest way that we found out that students were struggling academically wasn't necessarily through anything that was going on in the academic sense. It was all of the things that were going on around it. So their ability to have time to take part in things that were outside of academic life that might help them get more engaged in the kind of space of academia, or it was the fact that they just didn't have enough money to function properly. I think those were the things that really overwhelmingly stood out, and there is certainly always things that can be done more to improve the way that we support students in the academic sense itself. But actually, often it's so many of the other external environments that prohibit students from being able to really focus in the classroom itself. Does that answer your question? I'm happy to.
One more. Can I do another one? Researchers in these broad areas around widening access and success are getting very interested, as I'm sure you're aware, in notions around resilience. And I just wonder if that idea of students who are carers, who I guess by their very nature are demonstrating a certain degree of resilience, whether this was something that came through as well. So it's picking up Jonathan's point really, in the sense these are the successful carers who have managed to get onto the student, so therefore they are. Did any of that kind of come up as a sort of trait or anything? Can we support that more in universities? I think is what I'm suggesting.
Well, I suppose I think pretty much all of the statistics that I outlined were quite negative or pessimistic, but actually the last one that we looked at was the kind of positive impacts, and those students who had those success stories, really had a sense of achievement. The fact that they had an identity outside of being a carer, or that they'd really been able to achieve something for them and their families, I think was a really, really nice thing to learn about through that research. But I guess it's like you've said, it's how do we not just focus on those success stories, but try and turn other people into those successes. And again, I think it just comes down to balancing those things between access and retention. How do we make this environment more open for student carers, for carers to become students, but also how do we support them on that journey to create that success? And I just think that actually for an overwhelming number of people with caring responsibilities, they just would never even consider education. And that's why I actually think it's particularly important for the Open University that has such a good reputation of bringing in students from a real wide range of demographics and circumstances. How do we make the idea of going to study, and I think probably for a lot of student carers going back to study, a possibility? Sorry, there was nothing really tangible in that answer for you. That was just a lot of narrative. Yeah, chatty corner.
You mentioned the aspect of disclosure, so students feeling comfortable to tell their institution that they're a carer.
Yeah.
Is there anything in there? This is a thought. This isn't a question. Around sort of the need to better communicate to carers what they stand to gain from giving that part of their personal life to the institution, because obviously there must be a wide variety of possible enhancements that institutions can offer to individuals from any background, but let's focus on carers. So is there anything in there about what we need to sort of be more upfront about? Tell us you're a carer because we'll do all these things for you.
Yeah, I think that is definitely really important, and I think probably I imagine that actually for lots of student carers, sometimes they don't want to disclose, and for some reasons they shouldn't have to. They shouldn't have to be kind of boxed into this identity. However, if there is ways that we can support students better, no matter what their circumstances are, then I think it's really important that we know that, and collecting that kind of data, I think, in the first set is really important. More so because an institution can then track what their progress is, over a certain number of years. But just creating that space where students feel able to say that they're student carer and don't feel like it's a big deal is I think something, and probably I think a huge barrier to overcome.
Would anyone else like a turn before Jonathan?
Just a couple of questions of clarification, really. Was there any sort of difference in you said the institutional responses were quite different. Was that at all reflective of different types of university? I'm sort of thinking, sort of mission group type, different type.
I don't think we actually broke down the data into mission groups. It's probably something like with all data that we have at NUS, we've got a lot of data, we do a lot of research. We're always constantly kind of reanalyzing it. So it might be something that we could, something you guys are particularly interested in learning about. It's probably something that we could go away and look at. But I don't think in this instance for that report we did look at mission groups.
And the other was student carers aren't a homogenous group, so there's got to be different sorts of the care is going to take very different forms. It's got to be at different levels of intensity, different levels of emotional, sort of involvement and all that sort of thing. Was there any sort of sense that there were sort of cut-off points or markers that, if it was having to do so many hours of care, or it was particularly particular conditions that made it particularly difficult for students to achieve this balance?
Yeah, so there was definitely something in there. I'm going to see if I can bring up. I know I have a graph on this somewhere about number of hours and caring and what the relationship was. But I think, effectively it was like the more hours that you were doing, the kind of lower you scored on all of the indicators. There was that very overwhelming relationship. I can't find it now. But yeah, I mean, what we have the full report anyway, because it's about 60 pages long, so it's full of lots of graphs and statistics, so we can definitely forward that on. But yeah, there was definitely this relationship between the amount of hours that you were giving per week and your ability to, to study and to live well.
I just sort of wonder if there's a sort of other sort of aspects. I mean, I'm thinking of somebody I know who had a daughter with quite unpredictable mental health problems.
Yeah.
So she would assume that things would go on in one way for a while, and then it would go off on a very different tack, and perhaps other conditions or those sort of distressing and whatever, perhaps more predictable in terms of the sort of the weekly commitment. Yeah.
So because there's definitely something there about being a carer in itself. There's such a wide spectrum of what that might look like, and so there's something about the amount of hours that you're giving, but also the intensity of it. And there certainly is a relationship between that as well. Like you were saying about unpredictable circumstances, that can have a huge impact on someone's ability to study when you're in an environment that has a kind of very rigorous timetable that you have to sit by. And so that flexibility, I guess, is really important for enabling it. And I know sometimes it's very difficult as an institution to have that flexibility when you're looking after such a big number of students. But I think sometimes it's actually about asking those people what would work for them and trying to shape the system around them, rather than sort of trying to second guess what a system might look like that would work.
Excellent, thank you. So any more questions before we break for coffee? That's really interesting. Thank you so much, Colum, for sharing that with us. I think there's some really good work that the university have been doing that definitely builds on that, and I think it sets the sort of scene and for us to support our carer students more. So can we show our appreciation?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.